the army taught me many bad lessons, but one of the good lessons one of the powerful lessons was that all you have when the shit hits the fan is each other.
Welcome, folks, to If I Rule the World, episode 24, the podcast that's all about system change and how to make the world a better place. There are as many different versions of what a better place looks like as there are people, currently 8.2 billion, according to the World Population Clock. So this podcast is about speaking to as many of the change makers, the deep thinkers, the disruptors, the whistleblowers, all working in all kinds of aspects of system change. And I'm asking them a simple question. If you rule the world, what would you do? So we've been putting this very same question to all of you, lovely listeners, because this is very much about dialogue, conversation, community building, sharing ideas of how we can pull together, how we can bend and flex and flow and intertwine the many different versions of what a better place looks like. And I really believe that this is the only way forward. It's about consensus building, despite the very megalomaniacal sounding title of this podcast. I'll give you that. I was obviously power tripping when I dreamt this all up. But you know what? Why not dream? Like Jill Williams, who sent in this comment, which probably sums up, I imagine, what a lot of us are feeling and thinking, which is, well, Jill says if she ruled the world, she would stop the wars, stop pollution, stop cutting down forests, stop cruelty to animals, both wild and domestic. Jill, I'd add stop cruelty to our fellow humans as well. Jill would get governments to listen, to act appropriately, honestly. And Jill signs off with, I can only dream and do my little bit to help. Well, Jill, today we're going to tackle item 1 on your list, and that is war. What's it good for, right? So a little context for our community of listeners who I think are mostly people who I describe as nature people, nature folks, people invested in the conservation nature sector in one way or another. And I'm going to make maybe a bit of an allegation and uncomfortable truth, which is that I think we tend to be too silent on the topic of war. I have no idea where this comes from, but today we're going to go there because I came across this statistic. Just the Pentagon alone is the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So that's not to say that the lives lost, the terror of war, all of that is not important, but I'm just joining the dots because even if you live in a quiet, peaceful little corner of the world that's filled with birdsong, you're feeling the consequences of war. And that's not to mention your tax dollars, pounds, euros, or whatever else, wherever you're listening. B, war is something that a number of our past guests have said they would ban or get rid of outright if they were rulers of the world. And see, so have you. So how do we go about dismantling the world's military? How do we end war? Can we have a world without war? Or is there truth in the Latin adage? I don't know how to pronounce that, but it goes, if you want peace, prepare for war. Today, I'm speaking to one of those deep thinkers who's also had his boots on the ground, literally. Joe Glenton is a former British soldier known for his anti-war activism. He was the first British soldier to very publicly, loads of footage online if you want to look it up, very publicly refuse deployment to a second tour of Afghanistan in 2010 on the grounds that, he said, we'd been lied to, and the military was doing the exact opposite of its stated mission. Subsequently, by the way, the Chilcot inquiry on the Iraq War, the horrifying images of the military withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also recent reports from Afghanistan suggest he has a point. Either way, I don't know why I'm laughing because it's not funny, but either way, Joe was court-martialed and served prison time for his principles. Joe has since become a journalist, author, and media commentator, contributing to major UK publications and focusing on military ethics, on defense issues, as well as advocating for veterans and anti-war campaigning. So you know how on this podcast I'm always apologizing for straying out of my lane? Not today, guys. I'm absolutely making no apologies. This is a bloody brilliant conversation, which begins with how a young working class lad went AWOL in Afghanistan, ended up being the poster child for the anti-war campaign and for the Veterans for Peace movement.
Well, first of all, I grew up very provincial, very poor, working class, born in Norwich, grew up in North Yorkshire, to a parent from either place. But I think part of being from that background is a kind of critique of things and a sense of justice that working class people have about how the world is and how it could be. And it does not expressed by everyone, but certainly my parents were, I can remember specific things in terms of, like, my mum was a working class feminist. She, and that was part of our upbringing, the way you treated women and spoke about women. My parents both sold their labour, and they had to engage with employers who were unfair, often cases very privileged. For example, my mum was a housekeeper for some toffs up the road, and the sense of that we were one thing and they were another thing. And there are probably endless examples I could cite about how me and my brother as kids came to understand where we were in the world in relation to how the world was laid out, the kind of terrain and texture of the world. And I think part of it, I don't think it's the whole story, but I think part of it comes from that, a kind of sense of where we were and who we were and where we were in a system of class and privilege.
So as far as you're concerned, that foundation was laid almost right from the start, or were you aware that things like the world didn't have to be the way it is? I mean, or how did that sort of manifest in your life?
So I wouldn't say my parents were overtly political. So it wasn't like a conscious thing, but there was definitely a moral thing. And I think that's the starting point for my politics. But those definitely weren't expressed for a good 25 years. When I was older, I was in the army, and when I was in Afghanistan, that's when it really things started to formulate, were forced to formulate about who I was and what my relationship to the world was. Okay. And where I stood in all that. But definitely the kind of atoms of a critique, of a kind of critical reasoning started when I was a kid, and with my parents' influence and the influence of other people around us who had similar views. So
how old are you when you joined the army? And was it a sense of patriotism, duty, adventure, money?
Yeah, I was the old guy. I was 22, which is very old. We recruit very young in this country. You can join the army, sign up for the army at 15 and a half and join at 16, which is unusually low, even internationally. And when you go up to Harrogate, near where I live now, and go through the machine of basic training there, basically as a child, with your parents' approval. So I was relatively old when I joined. I was 22. And I always try and explain this as a spectrum. There is the economic on one end, and there is the ideological on the other. And generally, I think officers, the kind of management of the army, join generally ideologically, whereas most people who join the ranks, as I did, join economically. But it's never as simple as that, because we live in a country with an imperial past and an imperial present. And those things, the sense of who we are, influences why people join. A sense of patriotism. I think something which is not mentioned enough is because most people who join the military are blokes. I think 20% of the military is women, and it varies from service to service. It's very low, but it's also about masculinity and a sense of proving yourself. But I think that the main driver for me was materialist. It was a job, and it was a job that sounded more interesting than the kind of drudgery of kind of factory labour, low-paid labour, being a kitchen porter. But attached to that, of course, are ideas about British identity, about what it is to be a man, about a sense of place in the world, and about a kind of rite of passage. But I think as a starting point, you can look at it as this spectrum of the ideological and the economic. And I was probably somewhere towards the economic, but certainly there are ideological factors involved as well.
So, wow. So, I didn't realize you could join the army that young in this country. I didn't grow up here. I came to the UK when I was 18 to do my degree. I did biology at Bristol. I was pretty naive to the class system that exists here. It took me ages to figure out that when I came to uni, when I was asked what school I went to, I thought it was a really weird question to ask. Like, clearly, I didn't go to school here, so why would you even ask me that? And it took me a long time to realize that was a little bit of a filtering system, trying to pin where I am on this like hierarchy of, working class to middle class to, and beyond. So yeah, a lot of that was a bit of a mystery to me. So yeah, I definitely didn't know you could be that young to join. I know that it's been a while since you were in the army, but I'm imagining that maybe not much has changed, maybe it has. But what is that system that turns just a regular kid, whatever that means, into a quote unquote good soldier? And also, like, what is a good soldier?
The system of basic training across all three services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, is broadly similar, and the reserves as well. The part-time members of the military do a shorter version, but it has the same. You go through similar processes, and it has the same ultimate goal. And it's a process of socialization and social engineering over a very short period of time. Basic training, it changes every few years, but it's 12 to 15 weeks, the first phase of basic training, to take a civilian and turn them into a soldier. And they're all the things you would expect, the kind of boot camp stuff, if you like, the running, the shouting, the not getting much sleep, the firing weapons, the kind of hiding in the bushes and crawling around in the woods kind of stuff you would imagine. But there's also, I think there are processes involved which are much more subtle, and it's kind of they're implanting in you a sense of urgency, a sense of immediacy, a sense that everything can be do or die, and they're trying to speed you up, and they're also trying to make you obedient. The role of drill, the marching part, which we see, is to make you obey commands instantly. And that's something which over that period of time, they're trying to kind of inculcate, they're trying to put that in you, so that when you arrive in your unit after other further training, depending on your job in the military, you are kind of ready to hit the ground running in a war zone. So basic training, the register, the tone of basic training is much more like being on operations, where there's this sense of urgency and immediacy. Actually, when you're just in the military at home in your unit, whether it's in the UK or Germany or wherever it is, it's actually pretty much just like a job. It's like 8 till 5. There's a lunch break. There's like a gym. There's a lot of the stuff you would do. Your life runs according to similar patterns. You go on the lash at the weekend, etc., etc. But the basic training is supposed to be, the aim of it is to be much more like the rigorous demands of an operational tour, and it's a short, sharp shock to introduce you to do that. And I've long argued that I think with veterans' mental health, which is a kind of cause célèbre these days, it's often attributed to experiences on operations. But actually, what I have argued in my books and other people argue is that the damage is actually done, a lot of it's done in training. That sense of urgency and aggression, being able to draw on aggression immediately to get things done, is actually developed in basic training, and then through the culture of the military, your experience in the military, where that culture of aggression and urgency is reinforced again and again and again. So it's not to say that PTSD and things, terrible experiences on operational tour in wars don't count, but I think a lot of the damage is actually done through that process of socialization, aggressive socialization into a military mindset.
Wow. So that's an interesting reframe of the PTSD in active service story. I think for a lot of people, certainly for me, that actually begins a lot earlier than before you enter the sort of arena of war, as it were. I mean, one of the things I find, because you mentioned masculinity quite early on as maybe just the kind of the backdrop to you wanting to join the army. And I imagine for many young men, that might be the same. Young men and boys, actually, now I've discovered. But there's a part of me that sort of wonders, do you think that is, and it's going to sound awful, is it a necessary part of like almost traumatizing boys to become men so that they can perform in this way?
Yeah, I mean, the training wouldn't function. It hinges on that. And we can, I suppose there's one way to look at it, and we can and should be like, is it right or is it wrong? Can it be changed and improved? Can it be reformed, or should it just end? But in the logic of the military, that is what has to happen to get people up to speed. And that in the context of the military, rather than looking at it from a moral perspective, in the context of war, those things make sense. It makes sense to make people aggressive and make people obey orders and make people fitter and harder and tougher. It makes sense to do that because they're more likely to survive the war. If we're to look at it in that way, in the way that the military might look at it, then it makes sense and it probably has value. You're more likely to survive engagement with the enemy if you are fit and hard and tough and aggressive. But then we can kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the moral implications of that. And I would suggest they are, I think, kind of what I was getting at and what I've argued many times before is that when you come out of the military, and this is a problem, They don't switch it off. And that's why a lot of people come home, self-medicate, and that's why there are very high rates of veterans in prison, veterans carrying out acts of domestic violence, veterans on drugs, veterans on alcohol, veterans homeless, and various other kinds of mental health. Because that training and that process of socialization, which makes sense in the context of the military, does not work. It does not work outside. If you have if you're falling out with your boss, you can't attack him, for example, or at least it's certainly frowned upon.
Yeah.
Your only answer, for example, to all kinds of, I think that particularly in the early years after you come out of the military, anecdotally, talking to a lot of veterans as I do, you find out that your one response to most problems, to stressful problems in particular, is aggression, is an aggressive response. And that makes sense in the context of the military, but it doesn't work outside. And I would suggest, and I have argued, that there is a link between these two things, why veterans struggle to readapt. And it's not necessarily, experiences in war can play a part in that, right? There's definitely a part of it. But I feel if we only focus on that, it exonerates, it lets off the military system, it lets off the people who recruit young boys who are often already traumatized, and young girls who are often already traumatized, because these kids are not Russell Group kids. They're not private school kids. They're kids from sink estates in Glasgow and Manchester and Leeds and London. So these are people who are already traumatized by the kind of rigors of life under capitalism as working class people, and are then put through this further process. My argument has always been, if you only look at it's right to look at war trauma. It's very serious to look at PTSD and adjustment disorder. But if you only look at it, and if you center it, you exonerate the people responsible for a lot of the damage, which is not, it's not the people we're fighting overseas. It's actually the people who run the military and people in government, military and political commanders here at home.
Wow. Yeah. And as you say, like that trauma spills into the next generation. So even if you don't have a child that enlists, yeah, they're still going to experience that if they're raised by someone who has. So your first tour of duty in Afghanistan, so that's the first time you saw an active war situation, I imagine.
Yeah, it was the first time I'd ever got on a plane, to be honest.
Seriously?
23,
wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was an RAF flight to Afghanistan. Which isn't exactly Ayia Napa, but it was interesting.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I've got a vision of like an aircraft carrier, just all of you just roll in rows back to sort of bare metal. Is that
Yeah,
kind of
it was
the
very
scene?
basic.
I mean, what was like, what did you feel when you were on that plane heading out there? What was it like?
Exhilarating. It was exhilarating, and I think that's it's always a tension when I try and write about the experiences of war, and when I talk to people who experience war, that there is this tension. It is exhilarating to be involved in those things, and you have a sense of moment when we're talking about going to Afghanistan. And I was of the generation where one of our formative political spectacles, experiences we had was 9/11.
Yeah.
And there was a sense that this was our time, that there was this great enemy, because that's what we were told through the media, etc. There was this enemy to be fought, and it was framed in all kinds of complicated ways, which I now understand much more. But we're getting on the plane, and this was a few years after 9/11, there was a sense of exhilaration, of excitement. We'd spend a lot of time training to do that job. We wanted to do it. The soldiers are not generally, when they're young, anti-war. They want to do this thing. They want to experience it because they've been trained for it and they prepared themselves for it. And so, yeah, the first time I ever got on a plane was a RAF TriStar, which is actually like a big passenger jet, to Kabul. And then from there, we got on a rickety Hercules in Kabul at probably 5 a.m. And then we went on to Kandahar there in this clattery old workhorse of an aircraft, which has been around since Vietnam, and landed in the kind of dusty heat of Kandahar airfield.
That's wild, man. That's just, so any fear? No fear at all?
To a degree, but I suppose that's offset by training and by the fact you're with all your mates, right? These are people who've known. You're a new soldier, a relatively young soldier. A lot of the guys you will have been through training with, who turn up in your unit when you're posted to your first unit. A load of guys you've met since. These are like your buddies who you go drinking with and you get into trouble with, and there's you train with all the time, and you carry each other around exhausting physical trials of training of different kinds. And so you are, there's definitely fear, but there's also you're with your people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something which is heartening. It gives you courage, and you probably feel like you're young, you're a bit full of shit, you're a bit cocky, and you feel you can handle whatever's going to be thrown at you. So it's a mix of those things, and they sit together coherently, kind of in your mind and in your soul. You're like, there is this terrible fear, but there's also this sense of excitement. And war is a terrible thing, but it's also thrilling. It's a very thrilling thing. It's a very exciting thing in many ways. And I think you have to be able to look at that even-handedly. You have to look at that frankly and admit that it is both of these things. At least if you're an occupying soldier deploying with a big army with all this cool equipment, it's a kind of exciting thing as well as a terrifying thing.
Well, I guess it's why it's also entertainment for the rest of us that don't get on a plane.
Exactly.
To a war zone. So you've touched down. You're in Kandahar. I'm assuming it's as we imagine, as we've seen on the news. And what I'm hearing is you're well prepared for this. You're excited, exhilarated, touch of fear, but actually you've got your crew. You've got your brothers in arms, I guess is what people refer to as. Like, so you're a good soldier at this point, right? I mean, would you say that?
Yeah, I think to my eternal shame, I was a good soldier. I was a very good soldier, and I loved it. And I was going to do my 22 years. Like, I really enjoyed it. It was the first thing that ever gave me a sense of purpose, which is precisely why the military is so seductive to young people, particularly young men. I can speak to that experience most directly. But yeah, I was a good soldier. I was like, I think also because I was a little bit older, and a lot of the guys coming in were like 17, 18 into my unit at home. I think a lot of the more senior ranks assumed this was my second posting that I'd been in a few years and gave me responsibility, even though I was as new as the other guys. But I thrived on it. I loved it. I was like, wow, these people respect me. And they're putting me in charge of things. And I was, I mean, I think I ticked all the boxes of what is a good soldier, which is to be obedient, to turn up. It's not hard. It's not rocket science. Be obedient, turn up on time, be fit, salute the right people, call the right people, sir. Make sure you look pretty smart, at least most of the time. Try and excel on your military stuff. Try and be a good shot. Try and learn how to read a map. All the stuff. And so I think I was on the boxing team for a bit. So getting into the sports puts you on the radar of officers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so I think I ticked all those boxes, and that continued when I was on tour as well. I was organising other younger soldiers, organising them, leading them, etc., and was promoted from what my efforts on tour. I think 2 years ahead of the curve, a year ahead of the curve.
Right.
Given I hadn't been in very long. So now I look at it, and I look at those confidential reports where my officer commanding, the major in charge of us, has written up an assessment of my performance. And they are kind of funny, and they're cringe, but they're funny. But this guy, who's a very posh man, was like, Glenton is an intellectual soldier. He's this and he's that. And now I kind of cringe because I'm like, what? I don't really want people like that to be impressed by me. But at the time, the impact of that was really powerful. I was like, I'm being recognized for being good at something, probably for the first time in my life. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Because actually, I've seen your interviews on channels like, Double Down News. That's probably actually the first time I came across your reporting and your journalism, and the photo that gets used of you back in the day on that first tour of duty is exactly as you described, sort of young. What did you say? Young, cocky, full of shit. Like you definitely look like you're full of all the fuck offness of the world. You literally were like you look like king of the world in that photo. So what I'm interested in, so you're essentially acknowledging, you say to your shame, but you're essentially really thriving in this environment. And then what happens? Like the switch gets flipped at some point, because the next thing we know, you've deserted the army. What happened?
Yeah. Well, it's a question that's often asked, and you're a journalist, obviously, and I'm a journalist now, and I know we want the moment, right? We want the moment that it changed. But in truth, I think, and it's often the case for those things, it's a gradual drip, drip, drip process which builds up to that. And I think over the course of that tour, first of all, that tour was not, we didn't really know what to expect. But for us, for my little group of soldiers, it was actually a relatively quiet tour. Other units were out fighting. We were in this bizarre, it was like an American town in the south of Afghanistan with like a Burger King and lots of kind of defense contractors and a big American scoff house that sold lobster. This was not the heroic vision. That was not the heroic vision of war. And there were firms like Kellogg, Brown and Root, these big arms contractors who do a lot of the kind of day-to-day stuff, as well as lots of mercenaries, people who are like semi in uniform, walking around, a lot of private security contractors. And so we spent the duration of our tour in this strange, it was in southern Afghanistan, but it was like a portal into Americana in a way. It was a very strange place. And so we were one step removed from the actual fighting, but we would be briefed daily on what was happening. And I worked on the ammunition. And I think part of it was that it had been framed to us either by our commanders or in the press in lots of ways, which I now see are preposterous, but as a peace building mission, as an infrastructure building mission. It was a common trope at the time across the media, the liberal and the right-wing media, that we would go there and we would help women, that this was a feminist war. We were to fight a feminist war in support of these women so that they could, obviously brown women, racialized women, they could throw off the burqa and so on and so on. I think we internalized this to some degree, but what I actually saw working on the ammunition was that it very quickly went from this kind of slightly happy-clappy peace-building mission into an all-out war. And what it became apparent to me, even through my limited political understanding, that our presence there had become a lightning rod for not just the Taliban. The Taliban is a very nebulous term, but just for military-age men from southern Afghanistan who historically don't like to be occupied by the British, among others. A lightning rod for them to start shooting. And then the casualties and the deaths started stacking up. We ran out of artillery ammunition at one point. And I think over the course of that experience, started to at least question. It wasn't a political position, it was a moral position. I was like, this isn't really what we were told this was about. And then I can remember being sent press clippings from home, from family at home, which described a war which did not exist, which wasn't happening. And I'm not a conspiracist, and I'm very against any kind of conspiracism, but you can understand why I was looking at what I saw before me and getting these press clippings sent by my mum and members of my family describing a war that was making progress, that was doing all these things which just weren't happening. And I think somewhere in that mess and that chaos, I started to think, we might have been lied to here. We might have been lied to about this. This might not be what it said on the tin, as it were. So somewhere in there, that I think that a tentative critique, began to form.
Wow. Okay. So it wasn't sort of a particular moment in combat. It was just a slow build of, I don't know, the scales falling away.
Yeah, I think so. There are definitely a couple of events. I think we would one that's always stands out is we would have something called an O group, an orders group, daily, and all that means is a meeting. The whole troop gets together and meets. And I can remember some of the reports of groups of people, civilians being bombed, a group of women being bombed by our allies. I think it was the Americans in that case. And of just the kind of rhythms of combat on that first operational tour. This was 2006. So Afghanistan had been very quiet. We were the first ones back into Afghanistan. There'd been a war in 2001, a short and very light footprint occupation. And then Iraq happened, and Iraq was huge and more obviously controversial. And then we went back to Afghanistan partly because we'd failed so badly in Iraq, in American eyes. There was a sense in the British High Command and the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence that we had to go to Afghanistan and show them what we could do, because we're the British. We did Northern Ireland and Malaya as if those things were successes. But I guess in the British lens, those things were relatively successful. And we would go to southern Afghanistan, we would have a little patch, and we would bring our counterinsurgency expertise to bear. And what actually happened, as it happened in those other cases I exampled, is that it went massively wrong. It basically, that first tour in 2006 set the pattern which ran right up to the end of operations in 2014, I want to say, which was a violent kinetic tour with an increasing amount of resistance from the local population, and nothing which could remotely resembles this kind of the kind of liberal intervention that we will go there, that kind of animus that we will go to a place and we will help people, and it will involve the military just as security guards in effect, but we will go and help these people. Certainly the vision we were given was kind of like, and which the British military still likes to frame itself as, the vision is kind of Amnesty International with guns, that we're going to go and help people. It's like Save the Children with helicopters. And actually, we just ended up in a shooting war for the next 8 years. But it started on that tour, which had very high casualty rates. A guy from my regiment was killed, who was 18 or 19. But I think it's always this, as you're saying, this kind of cumulative effect. Mm-hmm. But there are particular moments which stand out, like those O groups, like the death of that young guy at 19, I believe he was.
So you say you're not going back after your first tour. And is that desertion? Like what happened next?
So I came back and was planning, in theory, if you've deployed, you can't deploy for the next 18 months. It's something quite strikingly termed harmony guidelines. And the idea is that you're not like redeployed constantly, but they are guidelines. But they seemed pretty firm, and I had planned to just sign off. You do a year's notice in the army, and I would have left. And it probably would never have been a really firm political or moral position, because I just would have left the army. I didn't really air these questions I had to, certainly not people in the chain of command above me. And also I was promoted from that tour early, as I say, and I was in this position where I'd been recognised and was being told, oh, you're good, you're going to go far. And I found this job that I loved in many ways, but also there was this kind of moral objection. And I was like, wow, I kind of love this, but I don't know if I can do this because I don't really agree with it. And I certainly at that time didn't have the language to kind of express that in maybe the way I would now. But there was obviously something wrong. And it wasn't, I think, a conscientious objection. I'm never that comfortable with the term. Is not something you don't just wake up and go, I don't really want to do that anymore. It's something that like you can't not do it. It's like a deep-seated conviction. But I had planned to just leave. I also, the early symptoms of PTSD had started to develop, and the army wouldn't diagnose me. I actually had to get diagnosed myself many years later before I went to prison. And so I was in a very weak position when they came to me and said, no, you are going back. And I said, no, I'm not. And I had this kind of tennis back and forth conversation with a sergeant, and he's like, you are going, this is the army. And I was like, no, I'm not, and this is why. And I tried to pursue that up the chain of commands as far as I could, and was of course ridiculed and attacked and slagged off, if you like, for doing that. And then I guess I did what thousands of soldiers have done in history, and certainly hundreds over the Iraq and Afghan wars, and voted with my feet and went on the run for 18 months. And I now know that the levels of AWOL during Iraq and Afghanistan were very high. Some of them were only for a few days, but often people went to other countries, as I did. And some of those people have never been caught.
Wow. Because that's definitely not something they like to talk about. And also just like almost there's this, well, in civilian world, which is where I live, the idea of going AWOL, desertion, like the image I have in my head is that you get caught, you get lined up on the wall and you get shot. Is that, I mean, to me, it's sort of like it's such a final thing to do that it's made very difficult for anyone to even contemplate. Is that true? I mean, I'm sure it's not, but that's sort of somehow, I don't know where I get that from even.
Well, that is very important. You make a very important point, because I think a lot of times when we think about desertion and AWOL, particularly desertion, we see it. The prism which is given to us is the First World War. And in many cases, if you're in the ranks, they didn't shoot officers. You don't shoot an officer. You just say he's mad and send him to recuperate in a nice hospital in Scotland. But if you were in the ranks, not a posh boy, you would be shot very often. And that is a powerful image. It's a powerful anti-war image. But also I think people who are for war, there's almost a kind of, and I encountered it many times, almost a libidinal urge to do that with deserters nowadays, or malingerers, or anyone they don't kind of like. It's the same emotional energy as like bring back the death penalty, as like stop the boats, send them home. It's the same. It comes from the same, basically, at least quasi, but probably openly fascist position that people who don't obey and don't fit need to be disciplined. It's the same energy as what we saw a few weeks ago in the riots, really, that there are these other kind of people, they should be disciplined and maybe killed. But that prism is a very powerful thing. But of course, now they can't shoot you fundamentally, but they can lock you up, which is what eventually happened to me. But I should probably clarify, because AWOL and desertion are slightly different. So AWOL is being away without leave, and desertion, which is what I eventually got charged with, is being AWOL, but with one of two additional caveats: intending to remain AWOL forever, or trying to avoid an operational tour. So when I eventually was court-martialed, they tried to get me on the second one, which didn't play out for them. And they also tried to get me on a bunch of charges. It's illegal to speak to the media if you're in the military, unless you are the media guy who's been vetted to speak to the media. So I kept, naturally being me, I insisted on continuing to speak to the media and doing loads of interviews, doing anti-war rallies while I was still serving. And so they charged me again and again for those under this very nebulous generic charge called disobeying an order. And the upper end of sentencing for that is 10 years each, which would have been very hard.
Every order you disobey?
Yeah, which was a few. So I guess that's the turnaround from being this very good soldier to being a mutinous, querulous barrack room lawyer, as they would call it. But they tried to charge me with all those things, which they eventually dropped. They eventually rolled over on all of those charges. But for a while, it looked like they were determined to lock me up for a much longer time than I eventually got.
Well, it shut you up as well, wouldn't it? I mean, you did do time though in the end. How long did you serve in jail then? I
eventually got 9 months, because they dropped all the disobeying an order charges and the desertion charge down to an AWOL. And I couldn't really deny being AWOL, because obviously I was AWOL because I wasn't there, which seemed like I was kind of happy to plead guilty to that. But yeah, I got 9 months and did 5 we have one military prison in this country in Colchester in Essex, which incidentally is where I was posted for my first posting. And the prison was across the road from my block. So I would see people being taken there and be like, look at that idiot, I'm never going in there. And lo and behold, 3 years later, I was going through the front gate of the prison myself. But and had a fascinating time. I'm still mates with a bunch of the guys I met in military jail, really good friends. I made some really good friends in there. And it kind of capped the experience of the military, and provided loads of good anecdotes for my writing, and an insight also into it's also part of the British prison system. So whatever they intended to do by sending me there, it made me, I think, more fervently anti-war, but also a prison abolitionist. So
wow,
so well done to the army.
So you've got like military systems, the penal system, and media, which is not something we've really touched on much yet. With a little bit. I mean, the fact that you're not allowed to talk to the media, again, something I didn't know. I mean, just to jump back to something you said, small detail, but an important detail, because you're like, oh, I'm not a journalist, I'm a wildlife presenter, right? I did biology. I've been a wildlife presenter. I'm really way, 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 way out of my lane right now. So there's going to be a lot of things,
You're
a
doing
lot
very
of
well.
things that are new to me. But just so let's look at this kind of relationship between the media and the military. And there's a quote, and I wish I knew where I got this from, but it stuck. And it was, the mainstream news, the media, is the PR arm of the military-industrial complex. And I just thought, can you unpack that for us? Like, what is the military-industrial complex? What are all the moving parts in this big system? And how does the news and the media fit into that?
This is a pet topic of mine, and I'm an advisor on the board of Declassified UK, who write about this, who are journalists who cover the military as it should be covered, with a complete lack of respect. Like, it should not be respected. These are not sacred institutions; they're just government departments, and they're one of the only outlets that do that work really well. They just recently had an article out about this, the relationship between the military and journalists. And I think there are many problems with that relationship, and I think it's got worse. And I think part of it is that the MOD, the military, let's just take the British military, right, is obsessed with the idea of good news. In fact, during my trial, we weaponized the fact they hate bad press to our advantage. And that was an absolutely conscious thing. They hate the sunlight. They only want good news. And so they're very keen to engage with journalists who are on the side with that. And the military will have a little group. It'll be the defense correspondents of the Times, the Sun, the Guardian, the Mail, and they will have this relationship where you're either in or you're out, and they will vet them and they will remove them if they write anything too critical. And that is how it works on the inside, is that if you want to be on the aircraft carrier getting the cool footage, then you're going to be pally with the MOD press office. And some of the reportage which this relationship has produced is absolutely bafflingly strange. Like you'll see reportage about rather than what the military's doing, where your taxpayers' money is going, what the war crimes allegations, etc. You'll see articles about kind of the SAS and the SBS, our two top special forces units, having a kind of British Bake-Off style competition. That kind of the level of tweeness of some of this reportage is frankly embarrassing. And if you're not in that gang, there's some space for criticism around that. But if you want to be in there's a really good example of all the defence correspondents in a wine cellar quaffing wine somewhere in London with the defence secretary at the time, because they're in the gang, right? And they're pally, they're mates. And it can't be ignored that a lot of the people who end up being those kind of defence correspondents for big papers are from the same class background. They are virtually the same people as senior people in the military and senior people in senior professional politicians. They are private school and they are Oxbridge. And that can't be ignored.
All went to school together. Yeah.
And they maybe not together, but at different times. They're in the network, right? They're in the gang. And I don't think you can ignore that. But you will find that people who like Declassified UK, I'll labour the point about them because I love them so much, have been blacklisted twice from memory, have been bad-mouthed in Parliament because as a crank outfit, etc., because they do critical, even-handed, careful, nuanced journalism about the military, about the intelligence services. They originally started doing archival work, so they were looking at the end of empire, crimes associated with the end of empire, how all the documents pertaining to the end of empire was, they fell overboard on the way back on the ship. There was the basement in the archive flooded, that kind of thing, right? And they are treated as pariahs very often and blacklisted because they do serious journalism. And I think this is probably the case for many aspects of British journalism and its engagement with the state or corporations. But I think it's particularly pronounced in defence, because defence is terrified of bad press. It has the largest PR department and the most expensive PR department of any government department. It has lots and lots of people and a big budget to do its PR, to do its spin, and it takes it very, very seriously. And you could argue that it's always been like that to some degree, but I think particularly the fact that Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. They were disasters for the people in those countries and for the military's reputation. That has definitely led to a growth in the kind of spinning capacity, a conscious effort to make the department better at lying and swerving and spinning in the subsequent years. So that's definitely a factor.
Yeah. I mean, because you mentioned the Iraq war in between the two the two tours of duty. Well, the second you should have done. And I mean, the Iraq war, famously, a war started on a lie. I was just thinking about how is that managed? And I mean, you've talked about like individual relationships, but I guess, again, there's another quote, Julian Assange, one of my favorite things that he said, well, there's a lot of things he said, but I think something along the lines of wars are almost uniformly started by lies. And he actually qualifies by saying that's both in democracies as well as in dictatorships. And he extrapolates from that and says, well, which tells you that populations don't like war. Like, you've got to sell it. So it's like a PR job as well as, kind of making sure that you've got all the right people telling your story. So how do you frame that? Like, the truth brings peace? Because, I guess if lies start wars, then it's that simple. The truth brings peace.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it definitely can. I don't think it always does because also we do know some of the truth of Iraq now and Afghanistan, and some of it we knew at the time. And it didn't necessarily, and even mass physical demonstrations didn't necessarily stop the wars, which is a source of great bitterness, I think, for an entire generation of young activists who spun off, in many cases have spun off into all kinds of other stuff. Now, and you're very
now, like with Gaza, it's
yeah.
like cripplingly disempowering to know that there's been so much activism and yet, nothing's changed.
But it's also, I guess, you've got to weigh that, like, things don't, like Blair didn't get what he wanted out of Iraq. He didn't get the full support. It probably brought an end to his term. It probably put the final nail in the coffin for him. And it continues to haunt politicians today. I think part of the right wing of Labour's reaction to Corbynism was really about foreign policy. It was really that he had this position which was widely held by lots of people, not even left-wing people, like lots of Daily Mail readers who I come across were really anti-Iraq. It was hegemonically seen as a bad idea, and correctly so. But I guess it's one thing that there is a generalized feeling, and another thing that it actually can be brought to bear and change a situation. But I think on the point of the lies, I think that it's absolutely true that most of them are. I guess we'll get to it, but I think there are different types of war, and I'm certainly not a pacifist. But I think in the cases of those imperialist wars, I'll call it imperialist war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course the war in Gaza has a colonial aspect to it as well. Syria, Libya, these other places all have a pronounced colonial aspect, imperialist aspect. They are riddled with lies, of course, because I don't think war is it often ends up coming down to a slightly kind of dull debate, I think, about human nature. Like, no, humans want war. It's almost like an argument about original sin. Like, we have this, we do this thing. And actually, I think people have the capacity for both things. But war propaganda, one of the purposes of war propaganda is to stir up the worst feelings. And an example which is repeatedly used, we can take the First World War. We see it in Gaza. We saw it in Afghanistan. For example, is the argument about women, about sexual violence, like these women are being raped and abused, etc., etc. And that was used when the Germans invaded Belgium, and that's been used many times before. We also saw it in Gaza, which is not to say no sexual violence occurred there, but I think that the argument was it was systemic during on the 7th of October. I think has been pretty roundly debunked by some quite good journalists. But that's one example of how it happens. But I think the key thing, what that conjures for me, is that a lot of pro-war arguments aren't appeals to reason. They're appeals to emotion. They're appeals to like a kind of base emotion, fear, hatred, ownership of something, that something's being taken away from you. And I think when things are based on an appeal to emotion, and the basest emotions we should be very cautious about taking them at face value. And I think most of those wars that I've mentioned, and a lot of wars generally, have been about the population has been recruited through a very base summons to kind of emotion, rather than reason, rather than critical thinking. And they are very seductive arguments. They're put in a very sophisticated and polished way. But that's why we always, if we're on the left, broadly speaking, and we believe in the project of reason, then we have to come back to it and be very cautious when emotional appeals are made to start wars, but also continue them. Because I can remember being told many times when I was campaigning against the Iraq and Afghan wars that, it's wrong, but so many troops have died, we can't stop it now or they'd be wasted. It's called the sacrifice trap. It's a mechanism that's used to keep the war going. And so there lies like that are often used to start wars, but also continue them. Like we've spent so much of our young men's blood has been spilled, which when you really look at it, is completely nonsensical. You should stop it now. To stop it so no more people die. But you will find very often those arguments are about a call, a summons to really base emotions, not thinking, not critical thinking, but really base emotional outrage.
Well, I mean, like I said, you've got this, possibly not unique, but you've definitely got a very interesting combination of experiences of having seen active duty and also seen kind of now as a journalist, reporter, writer, how that information is kind of presented, is managed, all that kind of stuff. And I guess, what you said earlier really struck me that, you were in Afghanistan getting clippings of how it was being reported back here in the UK. And the news back home versus the reality on the ground wasn't matching up. And that's kind of, for me, that's sort of like, truth is where all those lines intersect. That's where the truth is, and that wasn't intersecting very well for you. So we're going to jump tracks a bit back to how the military and the military industrial complex, how it manages its image. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of like its branding, like events that have sort of become like deeply embedded, particularly in British culture, which is sort of Remembrance Day, the Red Poppy Appeal, even Help for Heroes. Do you think that, I know it's probably not going to be a simple answer, but for me, it's, does this really serve veterans? Does it really serve peace? Probably not. Or does it simply just make more veterans that need help?
Yeah, it's a big question, but it's one that I'm very interested in. I've written about a lot over the years. I can remember when I lived in London, the first couple of years I lived in London, I was there up until a couple of years ago. Around Remembrance Day, I would go through whatever the tube station is opposite Parliament. I forget the name.
Don't ask me. I'm so bad at that.
The one right opposite Parliament. And I would go there and there would be a massive poster and it would be a poppy and a jet fighter. And it was like endorsed by, it was there to represent BAE Systems and the Royal British Legion, which to me, I think captured it, that these things are profoundly connected. And the idea that arms firms who have an interest in death, I call them big death, in the same register as big tobacco, big pharma, big death, this is what they do, right? The idea that they can launder their reputations by their association with organisations which are supposed to support veterans and injured veterans in the case of Help for Heroes is bizarre. It's bizarre to me that it should be allowed, and yet they continue to do it. Arms firms have in the past, they don't put that information out publicly anymore, but have in the past sponsored Armed Force Day, provided a large amount of the funding. And other parts of that funding came from already hard-pressed local councils whose budgets have been cut. And I find the whole thing deeply distasteful. It's important I wrote about the history a lot in my second book of the Royal British Legion. Help for Heroes is like the upstart. It's like the new one. And that was directly related to Iraq and Afghanistan. The British Legion and the Poppy go back much further. And it's important to note that when you look at the statistics, I can't summon them to my mind at the moment, but they're in my second book, Veteranhood. Very few veterans liked the British Legion at the start because they felt Field Marshal Haig, the butcher of the Somme, was the head of it, was the notional head of this. And he was not a very popular figure. And a lot of veterans felt that they called it Haig's White Guards, which is a reference to the Russian Revolution and the people who opposed the Russian Revolution. And a lot of those veterans formed up into other organizations which were radical, ex-services unions who were anti-fascist, who were communist or socialist type people, who many of whom were anti-imperialists and anti-colonialists. And there were 4 different competing organizations. Eventually, those were all collapsed down into what we now know as the Royal British Legion. But originally it was contested, and a lot of veterans refused to join the Royal British Legion because they felt it was too right-wing, it was too pro-imperialist. And they had this, just had, as I had once, just had this experience of imperial violence. And they came back and were like, we're not going to go back under the general who sent us over the top at the Somme or wherever.
Wow.
We're not going to go back in, we're not going to be Haig's boys again. And so the history of the Royal British Legion is much more complicated because it's such a monolithic organization. It's this huge, the Guardians of Remembrance and the Poppy and all this stuff. But actually, we've got to remember it's only 100 years old. And actually, when it was at its inception, it was deeply contested. And a lot of military people just wouldn't join it. On Remembrance Day, I don't mind Remembrance Day. Like, I can remember a time, I'm old enough to remember a time, even when I was still serving, we used to do Remembrance Day. But when it was the tone of Remembrance Day originally was supposed to be a funeral. It's a funeral, that is the tone. The cenotaph is a tomb. There is a body of an unknown soldier buried there. And it's supposed to be somber and serious, and it's supposed to be a moment for reflection on war. And what it became, because of the government and various charities and various military figures and the Sun newspaper, what it became as Iraq and Afghanistan fell apart, and we did very badly there, remembrance and the image of the hero soldier were used to discipline the population, to say, if you criticize foreign policy, you're criticizing the troops, to personalize it incorrectly, completely inaccurately, to make it harder to criticize British foreign policy. And that is not what Remembrance was meant to be. That is not what it was about. It's a serious and somber day. I would still go. If I don't think I'd put my medals on and my beret. I'm not really into that stuff, but I think there should be a space for a day like that where we reflect on all victims of war, right? Not just our guys, all victims of war. And I think that could be a beautiful and serious occasion. But what we end up with is this weird kind of Hollywood Diamante poppies posing, where people like Tony Blair and David Cameron, who've bombed various countries, can come and lay a wreath, where the royal family, who are deeply intertwined with the arms trade, can come and lay wreaths and pose for a bit. For a few years, I was in an organisation called Veterans for Peace UK, ex-forces, anti-war, anti-militarist people, and we would lay a wreath of white and red poppies on the day of the cenotaph, but they would never allow us into the official ceremony from memory. We always had to go down when it had finished and do our thing. And my fear is that it's become just part of the propaganda wing, that it makes the case for the military industrial complex, that it's been captured, and I would like to have it back, because I want that serious day. Like, some of my friends died in war. A number have died since by taking their own lives. I know a number of people have been injured. I would like that serious day, but I don't want it to be like it is now, which is a bit showbiz, a bit twee, not very respectful. It's actually politicized by the people who accuse anybody criticizing it of politicizing it. Right? I would like a somber, apolitical day to go and think about war and maybe have a pint with my mates I served with or whatever. But that is not what we've got now. It's turned into a farce.
You've reminded me of something, like when I first started presenting on BBC on Spring Watch, which I think would have been, I guess, Autumn Watch, given the time of year. And all the on-screen people were given a red poppy to wear, and there was a little bit of discussion around it. And I'd actually heard about Veterans for Peace and the white poppy, because there were a few options. There's the fallen sort of animals, I guess mostly horses, in victims of war. I can't remember what that is, but I said I wanted to wear a white poppy, and there was silence. And it was, no one ever said no. Like no one said outright, you can't do that. But it was this kind of weird, I don't know, I can't even explain. It was like this invisible kind of force that was like, that's just not going to happen. And I was very puzzled. I'm so naive sometimes when I think about it, but I was very puzzled about that and a little bit like, but how could this be a problem? This is about veterans and it's about peace. Like, what is the problem? But yeah, I wasn't able to wear that on air. I could only wear a red poppy.
I can remember there was that period, I think Jon Snow called it poppy fascism or the poppy mafia at the time. And there was a woman presenter on the BBC who got pilloried, absolutely pilloried for not wearing a poppy. And it's also like I knew people who were the generation of World War II and they'd fought fascism, right? And they were very like, in many ways, they were like, just live as let live, that old fashioned kind of liberalism, right? Where it's like live and let live. And those guys, the ones I know who served in the Second World War, and I think a lot of that poppy stuff now is about the image of the Second World War, would basically be like, just wear whatever you want, really. Some of them wore a white poppy, some wore both, some wore a red one. Sometimes they wore neither. But the point of that conflict, if anything, was for them, I think, for them, not me, I have a more nuanced analysis, I think, of that. But for them was like, individual freedom and basic liberty to do what you want and remember things how you want. And so the culture which has developed around the poppy, I think it's got better because it got really bad when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were on, right? I think that's a direct correlation because it was a cover for failed British foreign policy. But a lot of those guys were mortified by the idea that someone would be, who fought in the war. They fought in the war, but they were mortified by the idea that someone would be attacked for not wearing a poppy. That it's like this mandatory top-down thing. It was completely out of kilter with the way they saw it.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's a very strange climate around it. I think it's got better, but I think it's because those particular wars are over. And I think that's an important link to note, that these two, that poppy fascism and failing British foreign policy rode very closely together.
We're just going to take a quick break in the conversation with Joe because I want to tell you about how happy and proud I am to have as exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World, Triodos Bank UK. They're the industry leader when it comes to ethical, sustainable, responsible banking. And I got to tell you, each episode of this podcast is like a mini due diligence challenge. And I'm pleased to say they pass the test each time. So Triodos Bank UK exists to change the world for the better. Their mantra is using money for positive change. And they may not do it all, but what they do is make sure they don't invest in polluting, extractive, exploitative, destructive practices. And in terms of the war machine, Triodos does not invest in the arms industry, full stop. And to prove it, they are fully transparent. They publish details of every organization they lend to on their website. And it's why I'm proud and grateful to have Triodos Bank UK as the exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. Let's talk about how you would run things then. So if you rule the world, so this is the question I ask everyone on the podcast, to imagine, having been, I was going to say just being all powerful, just magically, but, we try and have this like, there's a democratic process, everyone voted you, to get over the fact that so many people on this podcast don't want to rule the world. I mean, when I started, I was like, this is a great idea. So how do you feel about that? You're like, yeah, give me the job, I'll sort this shit out. What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, as probably everyone else has done, because I know I've seen some of your guests, I'm going to have to caveat it and say I'm like an anarchist. I would immediately give all the power away to everybody else.
So
I never want to have. Yeah, I never want to have power, and I never want to have power over anybody else. But as we're here,
yeah.
I also don't think if you're a person of good politics, you should be scared of power, because power can be expressed in many ways. But I'll have a go. I'll do my best.
Let's go. Okay. So, what would be the first thing you ban?
The ban was very simple. Obviously, we know that Poseidon every year takes his toll in billionaires as a sacrifice. It seems to be what happens. He has a couple of billionaires in a boat or a submarine.
Oh my gosh, I've never thought of it like that.
Yeah. The oceans, and you see orcas attacking yachts and stuff like that, which I think is great. Nature knows, right? But I certainly, to save Poseidon all that loose change, I would ban billionaires. Nobody needs to be a billionaire. Nobody should ever be a billionaire. I'd question whether people
Yeah.
need to be millionaires, but certainly not billionaires. There's no need for it, and it would be part of. I think the theme of my thing is like redistribution and reparation, but definitely not a single billionaire ever need exist in this world.
Wow. I guess it's that question of how much is enough, and is there a point above which more money doesn't make you more happier? You know, it's like, what is the purpose of it all? So an outright ban on billionaires.
Yeah,
and then
to start.
To start. I love it. Do you want more? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Unleash the beast.
Yeah. So I think the ultimate aim, we want to abolish the military, right? But I want the military to abolish itself. And the way to do that, and some of this is slightly self-serving, is just to take the British military, but maybe globally as well, is that we should unionize and democratize the military. And partly that's because I think it would just, the natural endpoint of that is that the army will be like, we don't really need to be doing this. We don't really need to be going around the world kicking people's doors in. But I also, part of it's personal, because what I particularly relished about my own process of resisting the army was my own personalized experience of telling officers that I'm not going to do what they say. And I enjoyed that they disliked that intensely. These people who are used to authority, who are very comfortable in authority, who are bullying kinds of people. It's incredibly powerful. It's a liberating experience, but it's also an incredibly funny one when you say, no, actually, mate, sorry, I'm not going to do that. It's an awesome experience, and I loved it. And I think it should be generalized. So before we abolish the army, before the army abolishes itself, I want to see the officer class kind of suffer, suffer and feel, and just be really frustrated. And I want to eke that out for about 2 or 3 years and maybe televise it so everyone can see these people who were born powerful and have lived their lives in positions of power, see them really not know what to do. When your average troop who's from a council estate in Manchester or Glasgow, but they all get together and they're told, oh, you have to go to war. And they're like, no, actually, I'm not, unless you sort the housing out and you give us all a pay rise, we're not going. And I just in my mind's eye, I understand it's a bit of a fantasia, but I want to see, and I really enjoy powerful people being told, no, you can't have that. No, we're not going to do that. And I think that the experience of it is more empowering. That's what I experience, is more empowering than reading all the books in the world about it. You resisting people in power, just saying, no, Mr. Police Officer, no general, no sergeant, no politician. No, you're not getting your way. We're in charge now.
Wow. That's got to start in school.
Yeah. 100%.
That's interesting. And I'm probably going to misspeak about which hunter-gatherer tribe it is, but I believe it's in either Namibia or in South Africa. But there's a kind of version of that on a village scale, which is when, and I don't, this is what I've heard. I've never witnessed this myself, so all the disclaimers. But what I've heard is that when the men come back from a successful hunt, rather than being celebrated as heroes, and because it's a big deal, like people will starve if they don't do this right, they engage in like a few days of ribbing and taking the piss out of them so that it sort of brings their egos back down to earth. And I sort of imagine it's a similar exercise, except televised, and the officer class bringing it brought back down to earth.
Exactly. It reminds me of, it's a very big book. I need to sit down. David Graeber's last book, The History of Everything, which he critiques the idea that the Enlightenment is a European idea. And he talks about this idea of indigenous critique. And he frames it brilliantly, because he was a brilliant writer and speaker, where all these like poor, diseased, unhappy Europeans who live under terrible authoritarian monarchies turn up in the early stages of the colonization of the Americas, turn up, and all the Native Americans, all the First Nations people engage with them, and they hear about how they live in Europe, and they're like, why would you, that sounds terrible. Why would you do that? And his argument is that it was a lot of what we think of as Enlightenment values are actually what were carried back to Europe by these people who were attempting to colonize America, because they arrived there, and the indigenous people said, that's a shit way to run society. Why would you do that? And so But then obviously subsequently the Enlightenment's completely contributed to a bunch of dusty old white philosophers. But actually the story he's telling is much more nuanced, and it's about this collision of worlds. And he's a great writer, and it's an excellent book. Obviously he died a few years ago, a terrible loss for the left. But I'm really enamored at the moment with this idea. And I love anything that kind of debunks the kind of smug Eurocentrism, right? Smug Eurocentrism about where good ideas come from. And he does a masterclass of it in that book.
That's amazing. So I love the idea that the way to dismantle the military is almost a bit of like, taking the piss, turning it into entertainment, and just empowering people by reminding everyone that you can just say no. Okay. Yeah, I'm almost struggling to picture that because it's so alien to the way I've been conditioned anyway. So I'm imagining this world, the military is sort of being dismantled. We're all having fun watching that happen. I've just got to pause there because there's something that's glitching a bit for me, and it's really, I'm struggling to kind of like make peace with the fact that I believe I'm anti-war. I believe I don't like the military. Weirdly, when I was a teenager, I actually wanted to join the military. I don't know why. Like, there was no political reason why. I just was, maybe like a lot of people, I loved the Hollywood version of war. For some reason that appealed to me, and I kind of feel a bit weird saying that even now, but that's just being honest. So one of the things I'm now starting to realize is another bit of my conditioning, which is, I'm not going to lie, but I think I feel safe thinking that there is an army that's going to protect if some invading, like there's something in that, the way I've been programmed, I guess, to believe that. And so I'm picturing this world where, we've dismantled the army, we've got all these like workers taking over. And I'm like, hang on a second, this is starting to sound really unsafe. Like, do you really believe that we can have a world without war, a world without a military presence, countries? Thing you think is really possible?
I think it's like all these big questions, it's a difficult one to see. As you're saying, it's difficult to see what it would look like at the end, and it's understandable. I think that many people would feel unsafe. I suppose my suggestion is that not just the military, but the military-industrial complex itself is unsafe. Itself drives us. It becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy, which drives us further and further towards not just war in the conventional sense or in the counterinsurgent sense, like we see in Ukraine now, or Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade, but also in the nuclear sense, and that these institutions certainly frame themselves as being protective, but actually, I think if you look at what the just to take the British military, look at when has it protected these shores? I think I can think of two examples, probably one example when that argument can be made effectively, and that's the Second World War. And that's not to say the Second World War is the moral war, because it's much more complicated than that. But I think if you look at the history of the British military over its history from the 1640s, from the wake of the English Civil War when it was formed, it's almost always been used in an expeditionary way to fulfill the desires of one particular class of people in this country, which generally involves going to other places and taking other people's things, whether it's India, whether it's Africa. There's a brilliant map of all the places Britain has invaded militarily. I think there's about 5 countries currently existing that Britain has invaded at some point, even if only for a brief amount of time.
Wow.
So I think, I don't think the military makes us safer, but I do think, and I do understand and recognize that we are bombarded with the notion that it does. And it sits very deeply in people. Understand that's how ideology works, right? It's not just something that's out there. It's something that's like in you. It's inside you. And it becomes almost a reflex to think it about all kinds of things. And I think when we run into those reflexes, that's when reason comes in, right? That's when we have to return to the project of reason and go, why do I feel like that? Why do I feel like that? And it might be the case when you think it through that you're absolutely right, that there is something to it, or it might be the case that it's something which has been trickled down into your mind, drip, 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 and by the press, by culture, by the conventional readings of history and education in this country. And that's always something we have to be kind of aware of.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's why I was like, hang on, I'm going to have to press pause in this little game that we're playing, because I was like, I'm really feeling that sense of like, is this really possible? I feel desperately unsafe now. But also just another thought which came up as you were saying about, does the military make us safer? Does the military industrial complex make us safer? Another question I had was the law of war, which it was a term I came across. Okay, this is a little window into my online world, but I follow Scott Ritter. Do you know? I don't know if you...
I know of him, yeah.
Controversial. But he's an interesting character. I won't go too much into his story, but he talks about the law of war and how, I mean, if it wasn't so horrendous at the moment in Gaza, it would almost be funny. But, he does remind me a little bit of that Big Lebowski line where, I don't know if you've seen the film, but Walter goes, does nobody give a fuck about the rules anymore? And, and it's like, yeah, the law of war, that's a thing. It exists. It was, I think, written in the early 1900s. We've got the Rome statutes, all this legislation, international law, supposedly the kind of the greatest thing the human mind has ever kind of, created in terms of how we regulate the worst parts of all of us. If that was being observed to the T, like how would things look? Can you see that changing geopolitics as it occurs today, as we see it today?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think first of all, the laws of war as they are still allow for lots of horrible things to happen. They limit. Obviously, they're built on over many years on the things you've mentioned, but also I think that a lot of law about the conduct of war came about in the wake of the Second World War. But it still allows for, like, you can't use certain articles. You're not supposed to blow up civilians. You're not supposed to hit protected targets like hospitals and stuff like that. But even if all those things were enforced to the letter, the war still allows you to do lots of really terrible things. The laws of war still permit that. I think when we go deeper, and this is something we've really seen over Gaza, is that those vaunted Western institutions, among others, the ICJ and the ICC, have looked absolutely toothless and incapable. And I would suggest that those are constructions which belong to a particular moment and a particular place. Those are Western institutions, and they're institutions through which, in a sense, they're colonial institutions. They look out upon the world and judge it based on a kind of Western lens. And before I came out, because it was a very compelling question, I went and looked through who's been indicted, who's been charged, who's been convicted by the ICC. And you will find, with a couple of exceptions in the Balkans, Uganda, Sudan, Libya, Central African Republic, Congo, most of the people convicted are, and it's not to say those aren't terrible people. When you read what they're indicted for, they are obviously terrible people. But I just find it difficult to believe, just as a thought experiment, like in the same time scale in the time that's courts existed, have there been no candidates in America or Britain to be brought up on charges? I don't believe that myself. I can name a number. I can name at least one who's got a very well-known podcast at the moment, Alistair Campbell, who seems to have made hay since he used the Remain campaign to kind of recondition his reputation, right, and became a very popular big brain centrist figure, and he's taken seriously. Tony Blair is another one who also used the Remain campaign to recondition his reputation. And I find it, I think we have to look at that and go, right, if this court could be a good thing, right? I'm in support of international institutions like that in a broad sense, but I think it's important that we go and look who they've been convicting.
Yeah.
Like, what do they actually practically do? And now, obviously now that this has been going on for 10 months, we see it every day, right? And it's hard not to turn away because it's so bleak, and we're not even there. We're distant observers. Yeah. Obviously, and you look at those international institutions, among others, and you have to say they look really hollow. They look really hollow, and they don't just look hollow to us. They look hollow to the rest of the world. Like how hollow must they look to people in Gaza, to people in Iraq, people in Afghanistan, I'm not in this, but the international rivals, China, Russia, how ridiculous and how empty must those institutions look, given they can't seem to do anything. And I say that as someone who's like, great, they looks like they might bring a case forward for genocide. I support that stuff, but I can't help but think they're completely inadequate to the task.
Yeah. I think that's where this sense of being so disempowered and that feeling of, I guess ultimately it's assuming everyone is seeing the same thing, which is a big if in the world that we live in now. So depending on which way you lean on the Gaza, Israel genocide, if you call it a genocide, you'll see genocide. If you don't think it's genocide, if you deny it, if you call it self-defense, that's what you'll see. And I think that is probably where we are with this. And it's just like pretty hard to know how to get past that.
Yeah, I think there's a parallel lesson here with I was covering the riots, and I was very interested. I'm obviously committed to anti-fascism, but I can remember there was different types of response to what was happening, and there was a sense that people were like, "Where are the cops? Where's the state? Why isn't the government doing something?" And I think it's similar when you look at Gaza. There's a response which kind of is aghast, understandably, but also is waiting for big institutions to step in and save everyone. And my argument would be, we will save ourselves. That is the only option that we have. The police aren't coming, the cavalry aren't coming, Keir Starmer's not coming. We have to find a way to do it ourselves, because that is not what those institutions are designed for. They're there to enforce a status quo, which is deeply unjust and will produce things like this endlessly, again and again, until the world burns. And so it's on us. And I know it's a difficult question because it's paralyzing, right? It's paralyzing and terrifying to watch these things happening. But one of the army taught me many bad lessons, but one of the good lessons is, one of the powerful lessons was that all you have when the shit hits the fan is each other. That's all you have, is just each other. But often that is enough, right? Often that is enough. And I think that is one of the few positive lessons I can extrapolate from that experience, because it is that kind of team ethic, that kind of solidarity, which is taken in the military. It's squandered completely. But all we have is each other, right? That's all we've got. So we have to work with it. And we can't wait for the ICC or Keir Starmer to come and save us, because they ain't coming, you know?
That's interesting. Oh my gosh, because one of, very early guests on the podcast, Kene Umeasiegbu, a Nigerian activist who works in the UK now, when I asked him about this, he was like, the thing I noticed was that I was doing a talk in Germany, and he was really surprised that everyone's like, we just think the government needs to fix this situation. And he was thinking like, wow, because in Nigeria, we'd be like, the government's not going to do that. We need to do that. So it's maybe an experience that we just need a little bit more self-reliance.
Exactly. I think I agree with that, but I also think when I'm going back to, people as communitarian beings, right? It's we've got to be self-reliant. Of course, that's part of it. It's also about like the answer to when people are asking me, what do we do about the riots? What do we do about fascists? I'm like, well, you go and you find your Jamaican friends and your Bengali friends, uncles, and you ask them how they did it in the 80s when the NF came through. And they did it together, right? They did it together. They got together and they figured it out themselves in a kind of punk kind of way. They just DIY, right? And I think that's so it's a mix of that self-reliance and organization. And I think that's how you move things forward, right?
Yeah. So Joe, you've literally got the global tax bot at your dispense. What would you do?
Again, I think it's about reallocation. It's about justice, I think. And as my politics, the entry point for my politics is anti-imperialism, right? That's how I got political, and it still remains like the animating core of my politics. And there's been an increasing number of books and research done on empire and what it ripped out of other people's countries and economies. So I think the first thing I would do with that gigantic wedge of cash is a process of reparations. Around the time of BLM, you'll remember there was some discussion about reparations and what that might look like. And then it went kind of mute. There's a lot of good organizations who released a statement about their historical connections of their organization, maybe with empire, with slavery and stuff like that. And then it went a bit quiet, and it feels like there's a bit of inertia. But if I had the purse strings, that would be something I would do. But I think I would want to do it in a specific way. I don't want to I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in states. I think states and countries are a bad idea. I think we would have to find a way to give it to the people affected, the generations who've descended from those who were enslaved, those who were expropriated, those who were colonized and brutalized, wherever they are in the world. It's a massive task, but in this version of the world, we can figure out where those people went and ended up, and we would try and redress that. I think a lot of processes of historical, like getting historical justice, I think this is I've covered this a little bit in the north of Ireland, where it basically turns into a sort of talking shop, right? It's like a local history group, and it's important to do that stuff and talk about those things. But actually, I think it would just be the material way to do that is just to put it in people's bank accounts, drawing on that massive wedge of cash. So that as part of a broader program of reparations, and the same wedge I think we could use to get all the stuff in the British Museum and around the world, get all the stuff and send it back to where it's supposed to be, whatever it is. And all the museums around the world which hold stuff which was stolen from other people as tokens of conquest around the world. So that, I think that would be a big part of my spring budget, or whatever you want to call it.
Love to see. I guess that wouldn't be a King's speech in your world, so.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Actually, this is an interesting one because I was born in a very young Kenya in 1974. So what was that? Yeah, 10 years, a little bit more after independence. And I remember I was even at 4 or 5 years old at school, we would sing every single morning, gather in an assembly, sing the national anthem, the Kenyan flag goes up. And the sense of like energy and optimism and just hope was palpable even to 4-year-old, 5-year-old me. The excitement of this young country that had sort of peeled away and fought for its independence, gained its independence with real plans for the future. So that really resonates with me, what you've just said. But then I've also kind of going, hang on, there's a lot that's going on now. And is this a historical problem or is this a now problem? Because even today, the second largest diamond in the world, found in Botswana, and it was found in a mine that's owned by a Canadian mining firm. There is still a lot of colonialism going on now. We just don't call it that anymore. How would you deal with that? There's the historical context and there's the now context.
I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, I'd first of all add to that and say there's something about settlers, right? There's something about settlers. I'm reading Alberto Toscano's book on fascism at the moment. And there's something about the settler which particularly lends itself to just churns out horrible people. And I was thinking about Musk, who claims to be a man for everyone, whose family actually ran a diamond mine, was born rich and family ran a diamond mine in South Africa. And it just kind of summoned his image there, because he's a really good example of what colonialism produces, if an extreme one. It's definitely true, because colonialism is, and one way that people, particularly in Britain, exonerate themselves from colonialism is that they're like, it's something that happened a long time ago. It's nothing to do with us. It can't be judged by the moral standard of today, as if no one at the time resisted it, because of course they did resist it at the time. So it's not that different a moral standard. I suppose that the complexities and nuances of what a redress about that look like is something to be hammered out, isn't it? The other option is that we kind of leave it as it is. We in this country don't talk about it enough, and that the places where someone turned up and chopped 2 or 3 countries into 6, or withdraw all the natural resources, ripped all the natural resources out, or exported people like they were animals to other countries. I don't think those contours are tolerable. I think they're worse, and I think we can figure out a way to do it better rather than just leaving it as it is. And I suppose the key example of that is Palestine and Israel. Like, it's right in front of your face right now that we can see how that's what happens if you leave those things as they are. I mean, I can't project a clear vision of what it would look like or how it would get there. But certainly, I don't believe it can be any worse than how things are now. And they're likely to get worse, right? They're likely to get worse. This world is deeply inequitable because of the legacies of capitalism and colonialism. And I don't think you can talk about the two separately. These are the same thing. In the same way, if you're not going to talk about anti-capitalism, you shouldn't be talking about anti-fascism. These are the same thing, right? But what that would look like is, as a democratic leader of the world, that is a process which isn't just on me. It's on people to decide among themselves.
Mm-hmm. You've done your time. You've served the world. You know, you've brought on changes that, for better or for worse, that's what you did, because that's what people wanted you to do. They voted you. You had the mandate. You get to nominate a successor. So
I'm something of a piss taker, and I think it comes from being working class and being in the army, because the humour is very close to the bone, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. But I was torn. Like, two of my favourite cult figures are the comedian Stuart Lee, because I could just listen to him for hours, and I think he should just be in charge because his critique would be very funny. But also Gemma Collins, who I remembered as I was thinking about this, who I find hilarious. But I also remember was a big Corbyn fan. And I like Gemma. My politics are different to Jeremy's, but I like Jeremy. And I've been on platforms with him many times. Mm-hmm. But I just remember that there was some awards ceremony and she got really overcome because Jeremy turned up. So I know Gemma Collins is a secret lefty, at least. Wow. I believe it's true.
Well, she's been outed now, right?
Yeah, but I also believe she's like the funniest, one of the funniest people for one-liners. And I think it's between her and Stuart Lee, but it's probably going to be Gemma Collins would be my successor. So after I'd gone and I was buried in my gigantic mausoleum or whatever, wherever you get buried, Gemma would continue to enact my vision for the world.
Well, first of all, you've taken the podcast in a whole new direction with Gemma Collins. and second of all, like, I did imagine you would have a bit of a retirement period after this. You know, you weren't like being stretched out of your time. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
so
you get to retire. It's not a dictatorship, Joe.
Okay, right.
You do have to step down. I know we've had a few kind of like almost near misses in the States with people not wanting to leave, but
yes, definitely.
Yeah. But you know, you have a happy retirement. You get to sort of watch the fruits of your labor, and the idea is like, where would you enjoy that? Where would you retire to? Is there like a happy place for Joe Glenton?
There is a happy place. My though I may not sound like it, I may sound like a kind of estuary Essex boy. My heart is in the north of England, particularly in Yorkshire. So, and bearing in mind, I could choose any kind of really cool exotic location, which would be much warmer and nicer. But it would definitely be. I came back to the north for a reason. It's because I feel a deep attachment to the landscape, to the earth here, and the place and the people. So I would come back, but with another caveat that Yorkshire, by then, the north would be itself an independent country, independent from London. We don't need London. You, down there, they can do their own thing, right? And it would be an independent north, of which the capital is Yorkshire, is York in Yorkshire, right. God's country, as it's called. And I came back after many years. My mum is from here, a lot of my family, and I feel enriched by being back. There's so much. Some of it's just nostalgia because I was a kid growing up here.
Yeah,
but also the relationships I've built since coming back. The things I've reconnected with, and I do. It's a strange place. It has, it's a very provincial and strange place. But I'm very happy to be back, and I intend to stay here now for as long as I can.
If you want to hear more from Joe, he is the host of the Warrior Nation podcast, which is a deep dive into military affairs and civil society in modern Britain. He is also the author of Soldier Box, Why I Won't Return to the War on Terror, which is described by the late John Pilger as one of the finest books on the military and war by an insider. Joe's got a much more recent book, which is called Veteranhood, Rage and Hope in Ex-British Military Life. My takeaways from our conversation, the military might make us safer under certain circumstances, but the military-industrial complex is quite a different matter. So this is the unholy mix of politics, of profit, of media, and the military machine, coupled with the dismantling and disregard of international rule of law, of the law of war. And all of this is producing a world order where, or has produced, we might already be there, folks, producing a world order where might is right and that power is being abused in this scramble for access and control of the world's resources while humanity and nature are brutalized. So that was my takeaway. I mean, the conversation was packed full of thought-provoking, penny-dropping moments for me, and I'd love to know, how is it for you? What did I miss? Let me know. You can leave a comment on Spotify. You can comment on my Instagram, Jillian's_voice. You can email the show on podcast@jillianburkevoice.com. You can sign up for my newsletter on my website, jillianburkevoice.com. Jason, what else can you do? You can like, you subscribe, flipping heck. But honestly, I don't know. I really believe in this. I really believe in what we're doing, what we're building together. We, I mean the team, Editor Jake, Producer Sam, me, you, together with our wonderful sponsors, Triodos Bank UK. And if you would like to help grow this community, help grow this podcast, please share this episode with at least one person who you think will really get some value from this. And I'd be really grateful if you do. So rather than signing off with my usual, if you rule the world, what would you do question, I'm going to leave you with my final takeaway. And it's something that Joe said. Of all the things that he learned in the military, he came away with one good lesson. When the shit hits the fan, all you have is just each other. That's all we've got. So we have to work with it. We can't wait for the ICC, Keir Starmer, and I'm going to add COP or Kamala Harris or whoever else you think our heroes should be. We can't wait for them to come and save us because they ain't coming. It's on us. So with that, take a moment, take a breath, and while you do, if you think that's all true, ask yourself, what can I do?